quietly or there will be trouble.
Of course, machines can't think as people do. The machine is different.
Being, what marvelous being! How gratifying! How gratifying!
Thanks very much. I have a rule at home that if I get an invitation, I can say no immediately, but I can't say yes till I check with my husband. And in this particular invitation, I almost immediately wrote back and said, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. But I did actually follow the rule, although I didn't give him the chance to say no. We came to the Coolidge Corner a lot when I was a graduate student at MIT. I came here when I was visiting Harvard. It's a wonderful theater. And of all the invitations I've ever had in my life, this was the one that delighted me the most. So thank you very much for having me. So I'm here to talk about the conversation and wiretap and bugging. And of course, the conversation appeared in 1974, and many of us will remember that time. That was the time of Watergate. And of course, Watergate happened, or Watergate was discovered because of an attempt to put a bug in the Democratic National Party headquarters. Our picture of wiretapping typically is somebody with a fedora pulled down over their eyes, a trench coat on, standing in the basement of an apartment building with alligator clips connected to the phone. In fact, it looked a little bit more through the 1970s like this photo from The Lives of Others, another fabulous film, which if you haven't seen, I urge you to go see. The Lives of Others shows how wiretaps and bugs were placed throughout the apartment, and in this particular case, which was occurring in East Germany before the fall of the wall, there was a tapper in the room upstairs in the attic listening to everything the couple does in their apartment and trying to surmise exactly what they're doing from the evidence that he hears. That was wiretapping the old way. The new way, which is a picture from an FBI manual, is you don't actually do the wiretapping by putting alligator clips in the basement of the apartment building or in the telephone wires outside the house. What you do is you tap at the phone company. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that it's just simpler to do, and the other reason is for all sorts of things, for all sorts of advanced phone technologies like call forwarding, something that many of the people in the audience will not think of as an advanced phone technology. For something like call forwarding, you need to be able to tap at the phone office because the phone call never goes down the wire to the house. It actually gets switched at the phone office. So that simplifies wiretapping in one way, but it also makes it complicated in other ways because then the phone switches have to be designed to accommodate wiretapping. One of the things I work in a lot is security, and if you accommodate a phone switch to make it easy to wiretap, it's not just law enforcement who will wiretap the switch. But that's a conversation for a different day. Now, when you talk about things that make it difficult, one thing that makes it difficult for a wiretapper is encryption. And there are many forms of encryption. Encrypting mathematically, encrypting in other ways that, for those of you who've seen the series The Wire, and if you're interested in wiretapping, you can't miss The Wire, and it will take you many long winter evenings to go through it all. But there are many different ways to befuddle people who are trying to listen in. I want to talk about a different way to figure out about what people are doing. And it has to do with the devices that you all have in your pockets, and now I get to say, everybody who has their cell phone on, please turn it off before the movie. But all of you are walking around with little radio transmitters that are telling everybody, or anybody who's listening, where you are at any time. Now, if the government had asked us 15 years ago to do that, we would have said, are you crazy? And then we went and bought them and paid a lot of good money to do exactly that. Some of you may remember this piece of paper. This was the first leak from Edward Snowden. It's a court order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court to Verizon, asking it to release business records for 3 months on its telephone subscribers. All the numbers called, all the numbers that were called from a particular number, the length of the call, the time of the call. It was a real surprise when that story came out in The Guardian on the 6th of June, 2013. Because when we passed the USA Patriot Act, most of us thought that what we were passing was a law that enabled the government to get copies of library records, hotel records, records of an individual. What we discovered with this first leak is that the NSA was collecting all of the phone records of all domestic calls in the United States. Now, I could talk for a very long time, and then you wouldn't get to see the movie, about exactly how they used it. But what and I do want to say that in particular, it appears that they kept it as a repository and only were allowed to query it rather than to look at it in depth. They only were able to query it under certain very tight rules. But I want to go in the direction of what you learn when you do query. And this is from a report that the National Academies did on different ways to use bulk collection of signals intelligence. On the left, you might think of that as a pirate network, and the picture you might think of as a pirate network, with A, the person in red, being the center of one group, and B, the person in pink, being the center of another group. And you might think A and B are the most interesting parties in this. But in fact, the people that are most interesting are the people in yellow, because they connect the two groups. And they are actually the glue to how organizations work. So I want to go back a few hundred years. We're in Boston after all. These were the active groups during the Revolution. St. Andrew's Club was artisans, retailers, and men in seagoing trades. The Long Room Club was the inner sanctum of the Whig movement, so very senior people. And Loyal 9 was resistance against the Stamp Act. I'm going to show you this in terms of people. So these were the people involved. And if you can read very carefully, you might be able to catch who that guy is right in the middle. You've all heard of him. Well, Paul Revere was connected to all those groups. Because of the trade he had, silversmith, he sort of went between the low working class of the seagoing trades and the fancier people. And being connected to all those groups, he was in a position to be able to synthesize the information. Those are the people that are most interesting. And if the British had really been paying attention, they might have stopped him before he went on his famous ride. And the other part I want to tell you about Paul Revere, which is not as well known a fact, is that he was a bell ringer, which is how he had the keys to the steeple of Old North Church to enable hanging the lanterns. Well, what can you do when you have these connections? There's a delightful paper that was done by a couple of students at MIT, and they said, let's see what we can figure out by looking at people's Facebook connections. This paper is about 6 or 7 years old now. And they were interested in determining whether or not someone was gay, but not by whether the person themselves said they were gay, but by who they were connected to. And of course, it's not that surprising that people who are gay tend to have friends who are also gay. What's interesting from this particular chart, and of course this is a science series, so we have to have at least one chart. What's interesting from this particular chart is the percentage of homosexual females, gay women, who have gay friends versus gay men, and the numbers are somewhat different. But the point is that if you're gay, you tend to have a lot of gay friends. You don't have to be out in order to be outed by who your friends are. Or as one of my colleagues at Google said, Netflix figured out he was gay before his friends did. Very interesting result. So let's go back to telephones for a minute. After the news came out, it was not just Verizon that was providing this data to the government, but AT&T and the other phone providers. Two researchers at Stanford, Jonathan Mayer and Patrick Mulchler, decided to see what you could do with the phone data. So it's known that transactional data, where you are, is remarkably revelatory, but that's a nice theoretical statement. Let's see what you can actually find out if you get the data. And so they asked people to freely contribute their phone records, cell phone records or wireline records of of the phone calls they made. They collected records from 546 people over a period of months. And they found, people called health services over half the time, some of them called financial services, and so on. But here what was more interesting is what they discovered when they looked at what the calls people actually did. And so you get participant A called a local neurology group, called a specialty pharmacy, called a hotline for MS relapse. Do I have to tell you anything more? No. Participant B spoke at length with cardiologists, briefly with a medical laboratory, received calls from a pharmacy, and a hotline for medical devices monitoring arrhythmia. You know everything you need to know, don't you? Participant E, well, she called her sister and talked for a long time, and then an abortion clinic, and then called twice briefly 2 weeks later, and then again a few weeks later. What about B and C? C and D, I missed them. C and D were interested in firearms and also home improvement, hydroponics, and locksmiths. 546 people, and I've told you very personal information about 5 of them. Pretty striking. Let me give you this in a different version. Very interesting article in the New York Times last February in the magazine. It's called The Hezbollah Connection. So Rafik Hariri was the prime minister of Lebanon, and he was after he'd been prime minister, he was assassinated in 2005 by a truck bomb. Truck bomb came at his entourage, and it was all over. So the Times described the research done by a very thorough researcher. Now, this was back in 2005 when it happened, and at that time, people weren't tracking cell phones so much. But this researcher started looking at all the cell phone calls made around the time of his assassination, and then looked historically back. And he discovered 5 interesting groups of cell phones. He called them green, purple, blue, red, and yellow probably. Green was one group of cell phones. All of the cell phones were anonymous. You couldn't track them to people who were, the names attached to the cell phones were not real people in Beirut. And some of them had been purchased outside of Lebanon. The green group made calls just to each other and occasionally to one of everybody in each of the other one of each of the other groups. There was only one person in each of the other groups they contacted. The blue group had 15 phones that tracked Hariri. The yellow group also had 15 phones that tracked Hariri. The purple group was a cover operation, so when Hariri was assassinated, there was a video that came out, and somebody said that he had assassinated Hariri. But this was somebody who was not very directed, not very smart, he did not seem like the right sort of person. And what they figured out is that his body had been buried elsewhere, and by looking at all the remains that were around the scene of the assassination, his body parts did not show up anywhere in the assassination. And so that was just an attempt to cover up who actually did the assassination. There was one other group also of cell phones. By tracking the 5 sets of cell phones, they were able to figure out who did it. And then, because there was a little bit of OPSEC that was not done properly, one person accidentally called a furniture dealer twice with one of the purple phones or green phones. They were able to actually begin to put names, but the case is still going on in The Hague. And of course, the people involved are not actually present. I want to talk now about something slightly different. A marvelous book by Timothy Garton Ash, who was a journalist who'd been doing research as a historian in East Germany before the fall of the wall. After the fall of the wall, he went to look up his Stasi file, and he found a fairly big file. And he wrote a book about trying to figure out who had informed on him in what way. The book opens with a startling and very stark scene where he's in a room with his girlfriend, and she throws open the shades, and all the lights are on them, and they're about to do intimate things. And as he starts the book, he says, "Reading my files, I wondered if Andrea was one of the informers." And I won't tell you more about what he discovers. But one of the points he makes in his book is that when he first came into East Germany, the East German guards knew his height, his eye color, his hair color, the make of his car, but they didn't know that he wrote for the BBC. And what's interesting about that is that sometimes when you're spying, when you're listening in, when you're wiretapping, or you're bugging, you think you have the important information. But you have partial bits of information, and they may be part of the picture, or they may not. Well, you're here to see a movie, which is a piece of literature. So I think I should end with Hamlet. So there's Olivier's Hamlet, and of course Gielgud's Hamlet, And for those of us lucky enough to be in London right now, there's Benedict Cumberbatch's Hamlet. And then I discovered as I was preparing this talk, I knew I had seen an absolutely marvelous Hamlet in Stratford in 1975, but I didn't realize that it was Ben Kingsley at the time, because he wasn't Ben Kingsley then. But why do we have all these different Hamlets? Isn't Laurence Olivier enough? Why do, we have Shakespeare's words, we have a masterful performance by Olivier, and yet we go and we see all these different Hamlets. So what is it? Well, it turns out, of course, that they're different interpretations. They're the words on the page, and then there's how you read the words, how you see the character, and it becomes a completely different person. So Kingsley as Hamlet was described as having a desperate grandeur, and that he was utterly sane, which is to say, he knew he's but mad north by northwest, and when the wind was southerly, he knew a hawk from a handsaw. Benedict Cumberbatch, by contrast, was described as almost like a barrister, like a lawyer, very straight. Gielgud's Hamlet is a moody, modern youth who needed spanking. And Olivier, the one that's supposed to be romantic, well, indeed, the interpretation that the reviews described him as was solid and virile, plainly tormented. One play written 400 years ago with so many different interpretations. Of course, we see that with Shakespeare all the time. When you see the words on the written page, when you see what's been noted, that's the interpretation you take you have partial information, and you don't hear the tone of voice, and you don't know what's said, and you don't know the gesture. And so with that, I leave you for the conversation. Thank you.